A man walked into the woods at midnight, but the person who came back wasn't the same. Tonight's stories involve isolated highways, home intruders, and a funeral home encounter that still can't be explained. This took place a little over a decade ago when I had a job that required me to frequently drive long distances, often alone, and at hours that were far from convenient. At the time, I didn't think much of it. I was single, had no children, and honestly, there was something oddly serene about cruising down empty highways late at night, especially when you spend most of your day surrounded by people. That evening, I had already been on the road for hours. I'd finished some work in a small city and was heading back home, with several more hours of driving still ahead of me. The route was one of those long, desolate stretches of rural highway where you could go 10 or 15 minutes without encountering another vehicle. When I finally pulled over and checked my phone, it was just after midnight. Up to that point, everything about the drive was uneventful: clear skies, no wind, the air outside cool and crisp. The highway cut through miles of dense wooded areas, with occasional dirt roads or narrow trails branching off to either side. Most of these offshoots appeared to be old service roads or access paths leading deeper into the forest. The trouble began when exhaustion started to catch up with me. This wasn't just a mild case of drowsiness, it was the heavy, bone-deep weariness that makes it impossible to keep your eyes open. A few times, I caught myself unintentionally drifting in my lane before jolting awake, which was a clear warning sign. I'd always been careful about not pushing my limits while driving because I'd seen firsthand how dangerous falling asleep at the wheel could be. So when I spotted one of those dirt trails leading away from the road, I decided to play it safe. Slowing down, I guided the car onto the trail. It wasn't paved, just packed dirt and gravel, and it only extended 30 or 40 feet before widening into a small clearing. The spot itself looked like the kind of place hunters or hikers might use as a makeshift parking area during the day. Thick trees surrounded it on all sides, creating an imposing wall of darkness, and through the foliage behind me, I could just barely make out the highway. I turned off the car, reclined my seat slightly, and set a timer on my phone for 30 minutes. The plan was simple: grab a quick nap to clear my head before getting back on the road. The place didn't feel ominous at the time, it just seemed quiet and secluded, a decent spot to catch some rest. When I woke up, it took me a moment to piece together where I was. Still groggy, in that hazy state between sleep and wakefulness, I stared out through the windshield as my brain worked to reorient itself. That's when I noticed something unusual: headlights. At first, I thought it was just another car driving past on the highway behind me. But something felt off, the movement of the light wasn't right. Instead of speeding past like typical traffic, it seemed to linger and grow progressively brighter. A sinking realization hit me: another vehicle had turned off the highway and was pulling into the same clearing where I was parked. Instinctively, I slouched down slightly in my seat while keeping an eye on the approaching car. It wasn't that I felt immediately threatened, but when you're alone in an isolated area in the middle of the night, wariness around strangers is only natural. The vehicle that pulled in stood out. It was strikingly upscale. Even under dim light, I could tell it was a luxury car. Sleek, dark-colored with a low profile that radiated wealth. Definitely a far cry from anything I'd ever owned at that point in my life. The car came to a stop about 40 feet away from mine. After a few moments, the driver killed the engine but left the headlights on briefly, casting an eerie glow over the small clearing. Peering through the glare, I could make out a man sitting behind the wheel. He looked to be in his 40s and appeared almost meticulously put together: sharp jacket, clean-cut hairstyle, like he had just attended some formal event and planned every detail of his presentation. He stayed there for maybe a full minute before getting out of the car. What struck me as odd was how purposeful his movements seemed from the start. He didn't pause to glance around or take stock of his surroundings, not even for a second. Without hesitation, he closed his door and walked directly toward a narrow footpath leading into the woods, a small trail that had escaped my attention earlier when I arrived. It wasn't much more than a worn patch where grass and underbrush had been trodden down repeatedly by previous visitors. And just like that, he disappeared into the trees. He followed the winding path into the darkness, gradually swallowed by the shadows. I assumed he just needed a quick bathroom break. Nothing unusual. People often pull over on the side of the road for that sort of thing. The clearing returned to an eerie stillness as I glanced at my phone. Only about 15 minutes had passed since I'd set my alarm. My car remained off and I purposely left the lights off, better not to draw any unnecessary attention. My plan was simple: wait it out until the alarm went off, then leave. About 10 or 15 minutes later, I saw someone emerging from the woods, heading toward his car. At first, I thought it was him returning as expected. But as the figure approached, I noticed something that sent a slight buzz of confusion through me. The silhouette was different. It wasn't him. This person looked like a woman. She had longer hair, and her outfit looked like a dress or skirt. Her movements were measured and deliberate, almost like she was navigating uneven ground in heels. I shifted in my seat to get a better look. She reached the sleek, expensive car, opened the driver's door, and slid inside without hesitation. My pulse quickened as I stared at the windshield of that car, my thoughts scrambling to reconcile what I was seeing. I would have sworn it was a man who had gone into the woods earlier, not just assumed but certain. The short haircut, the way he carried himself, it had all screamed man. And yet here she was now, her appearance totally inconsistent with what I thought I'd seen before. Maybe I was mistaken? It was dark after all. People see what they expect to see in low light. Could it have been her the entire time? That seemed like the most rational answer. Before I could think too much more about it, the car started up again. Its engine pierced the otherwise silent clearing before it slowly rolled toward the highway. I kept watching as its headlights faded behind the dense trees, leaving me alone in the dark once more. I leaned back in my seat, trying to shake off the unease creeping up my spine. It was late. My eyes were strained and my mind was groggy from fatigue. It was probably just some weird trick of perception. That made sense, right? With no real answer coming to mind, I let out a sigh and told myself to stop overthinking it. Minutes later, the loud trill of my phone alarm snapped me out of my haze. Time to go. I silenced it and stretched awkwardly in my seat, preparing to start the car and get back on the road. But before I could even reach for the keys, a pair of headlights appeared again beyond the trees. My first thought was innocent enough. Another car must have pulled in after me. But then the vehicle came into full view and my stomach turned to ice. It was the same car. The exact same expensive luxury sedan that had just driven off not long ago. My breath caught as it rolled back into its previous parking spot, aligning almost perfectly where it had been before. The driver's door opened slowly, and I felt my chest tighten when I saw who stepped out. It was him, the man who had first walked into the woods earlier, but this time, something else was deeply wrong. He was wearing what could only be described as her outfit. The dress, the long hair, everything that defined the woman from before down to the eerie details seemed unchanged except for his build and face. The headlights from his car reflected sharply on the gravel path, illuminating every unsettling nuance vividly. It wasn't just my imagination. I'd been frozen with disbelief before. Now, mounting dread gripped me entirely as I stared from a distance at this uncanny scene unfolding before me. He took only a few steps away from his vehicle and pulled out a phone. His demeanor was visibly tense. He kept pacing slightly as he spoke into it, his voice carrying faint bursts of words that were clipped and hurried but still too muted for me to understand their content. Every so often he would pause, clearly listening intently to whoever might be on the other end. I couldn't think straight or even fully process what I was seeing. I just sat there trapped between reason and instinctual fear as my mind tried fruitlessly to explain away what defied logic altogether. After pacing for a short while, he abruptly stopped and stood motionless, his gaze fixed on the distant highway. Then, without explanation, he pivoted and retreated toward the woods. The whole scene felt unsettlingly out of place. If he was merely changing clothes, why return here? And why choose the seclusion of the woods for such an odd task? Minutes ticked by and another car approached the clearing, a second set of headlights piercing the darkness. But this car didn't turn on its lights upon arrival. Instead, it crept forward silently, extinguishing its beams just before entering the clearing, heightening the tension in the already peculiar atmosphere. The vehicle exuded a high-end aura, different in make but similar in its expensive aesthetic to the first. The driver stepped out, a second man, and surveyed the area briefly before heading straight for the same trail into the woods. By then, my gut instinct told me something wasn't right at all. Frozen in place, I stayed hidden in my car, blending into the shadows. The two figures disappeared deeper into the forest where my line of sight ended. For a time, nothing happened. Silent minutes stretched endlessly, making me feel more uneasy with every second. Then a faint orange flicker emerged from between the trees. The light grew steadily stronger, unmistakably fire, a substantial blaze from the look of it. Soon after came noises, distant and distorted by the foliage. At first I couldn't discern what they were, only that they carried a charged intensity. Then it became clear, yelling. Not ordinary voices raised in casual anger but strained, erratic shouts punctuated by moments of eerie silence. Occasionally there was a sound so raw it resembled a scream of pain. Cold unease settled deep in my chest as I strained to identify the source of the horrific noise. The chaotic, broken rhythm didn't fit the pattern of a normal argument or confrontation. These erupting bursts felt far more sinister. Flickering firelight continued to pulse through the trees until, with no warning, the shouting stopped. Moments later, both men emerged from the woods, but something was immediately different. The man in the dress now appeared barely able to walk, faltering with every step. Blood stained his clothing, dark patches sweeping across the front and down one sleeve like visible evidence of unimaginable suffering. The other man half carried him, gripping him tightly to help him move forward. Together they stumbled back to the second car in silence. No exchanged words that I could overhear. Once they reached the vehicle, the injured man struggled to get into the passenger seat while his companion held the door open for him. Finally inside, he collapsed against it as though every movement had drained his remaining strength. Without delay, the driver shut him in, started the engine, and reversed from the clearing with jarring urgency. Moments later, their car sped into darkness and vanished beyond my line of sight. Still parked in that eerie clearing was the first car, the injured man's original vehicle, abandoned like an ominous artifact of whatever had transpired within those woods. For me, that was when reality came crashing in with brutal force. Until then, I had observed everything as if distantly, like watching some unfathomable drama unfold before me. But there it was, bloodied clothes, desperate pain, frantic flight, all evidence pointing to something terrifyingly real. Frantic thoughts flooded my mind. Crime? Illegal dealings? Violence? Every possibility made me more certain I needed to leave immediately. If those men turned back toward me for any reason, I pushed down my growing panic as quietly as possible, started my car without activating my headlights to avoid detection, and slowly backed up onto the highway. Once free from that clearing's oppressive atmosphere, I drove for nearly an hour straight before finally breathing without a racing heart. The image of that man, staggering under his own weight in a blood-soaked dress, has since haunted me in ways I cannot shake. Even today, in my 30s and far removed from childhood memories dulled by time, this night remains vivid in ways most others do not. Life has moved on, neighborhoods transform, families relocate, but certain fragments of personal history refuse to fade. Growing up in a rural town fringed by quiet spaces had always carried a strange tension. Our community wasn't a picturesque country living as most imagine it, it leaned toward solitary lifestyles marked by unspoken boundaries. Perhaps that inclination for privacy made moments like this harder to confront. But one detail has burrowed into my thoughts over all these years. That car left behind in those woods. Whoever it belonged to never retrieved it, not while I lingered there, and it might have remained untouched long after my hasty departure. These lingering questions still tighten something deep inside me whenever I allow myself to remember that night, the night nothing seemed quite sacred or safe anymore. It was technically just a 2-minute walk down the road, but in my family, you'd think my grandfather lived on the other side of the world. The way people talked about him made it feel like there was an invisible gulf between his house and the rest of us, something far greater than the physical distance. Even as a kid, I could sense there was something off about him. He was hard to define, impossible to really explain. The adults in my life rarely mentioned him directly, but whenever his name came up, the air seemed to change. Conversations grew tense, uneasy. Sometimes, late at night, I'd overhear muffled arguments about him. My parents never realized I wasn't asleep. The truth was, he had a reputation, a troublesome one. He'd been arrested a few times while I was growing up, though details were scarce. Back then, no one would give me a clear answer about what he'd done. When I asked questions, the response was always a deflection. "You're too young to understand," or an almost practiced vagueness that left me chewing on scraps of information. What became evident, even to a child, was that there were plenty of people in the community who despised him. Not just casual dislike or fleeting annoyance, there was genuine bitterness there. And occasionally, strangers would appear in the neighborhood looking for him, men whose presence felt completely out of place. Our streets were quiet, predictable, safe even, but these men brought an edge with them that felt anything but. Sometimes cars would roll up to his property late at night and idly sit there with their lights off. Other times, unfamiliar men stood outside his house having hushed, terse conversations with him that seemed far from friendly. My parents hated going near his place. They didn't outright forbid me from venturing by, but it was clear, through their words and their body language, that they wanted as much space between him and us as possible, even though he lived just down the street. Visits were rare and strained. He showed up at our house maybe once or twice in all the years I can remember, but those were quick and uncomfortable occasions where my parents barely concealed their dread. Then there was the time he got arrested again, except this time, it wasn't for a slap on the wrist kind of offense. It was serious enough to send him to prison for years. I never learned exactly what happened. No one in the family seemed eager to recount those events in detail. All I know is that he was gone after that, leaving his house behind like an unwanted shadow. His home, a dilapidated two-story building framed by old trees, had always had an air of neglect about it, but after his arrest it transformed into something unmistakably forsaken. The yard turned wild and overgrown. Weeds clawed their way up through gaps in the fence and spread across the property like they owned it now. The once faded paint began peeling in long, curling strips, revealing splintered wood beneath. Skeletal branches stretched toward the roof as though trying to reclaim it for nature itself. Some days you'd spot a stray cat slinking through the yard or birds roosting in the eaves of the porch. For all intents and purposes, the house became part of the scenery, an ominous monument to our family's shared aversion to its existence. We pretended it wasn't there. That was easier than confronting what it represented or dredging up old emotions we'd buried for survival's sake. Month after month passed, until over a year had gone by without anyone so much as mentioning it out loud anymore. By then, it had become background noise, familiar and easy to ignore, at least until I found myself riding my bike past it during lazy summer afternoons. Even then I couldn't help feeling unsettled every time my eyes wandered toward it. Not because I thought it was haunted or anything ridiculous like that. I wasn't one for ghost stories even as a kid, but because just looking at that place stirred all those cold whispers and half-truths about my grandfather back to life. One particular evening stands out in my memory like a splinter under the skin, sharp and persistent no matter how much I try to let it fade away. It was summer break, still bright outside long after dinner had ended. Our windows were open to invite in whatever breeze might cool the house before bedtime. I sat alone in the living room watching TV while my parents talked quietly in the kitchen down the hall. It must have been around 9 or 10 o'clock when something drew my attention to the window near the road. There was someone out there. It caught me off guard because by that time of night, our little street was usually deserted aside from the occasional car cutting through town. But sure enough, there was a figure moving slowly near my grandfather's abandoned property. They were walking along the edge of the yard. At that moment they simply stood still. At the time I thought it might be someone just scoping out the property, perhaps a curious neighbor wondering about the vacant house. But as the seconds ticked by, they didn't move, staying frozen in place. Uneasy, I called out to my dad. He joined me at the window and stared for a short while. I pointed directly at the house, explaining there was someone standing there. His face darkened with concern as he decided to step outside and investigate. From the doorway, I watched him walk down the brief stretch of road toward my grandfather's property. He lingered in the yard, carefully scanning the area for any signs of activity. After what felt like an eternity, he returned and told me there was no one there. I tried insisting on exactly where I'd seen the figure, but my dad shook his head, claiming the yard was entirely empty. I reasoned that maybe whoever it was had slipped away when my dad approached. It seemed like the only plausible explanation. And yet, a lingering unease tugged at me as I stared at that empty house. There was an eerie weight to it, like the place itself was observing us. The following morning, everything changed. My dad left early to check up on the property, perhaps intending to pick up mail from its neglected mailbox. When he returned only moments later, his face was a tense mask of worry. I overheard him quietly tell my mom that someone had broken into my grandfather's house during the night. The front door lock was wrecked and part of the frame had been splintered, as if someone had forced their way inside. I stood in the kitchen, trying to follow my parents' whispered conversation as they debated whether to call the police. Eventually they made the call. Officers arrived later that morning to inspect the property. Although I wasn't allowed near the scene while they worked, I stood in our yard and watched as they walked through my grandfather's house. Even then, I could sense how deeply unsettled my parents were by everything happening around us. Though they cooperated with the police, it was clear they wanted to distance themselves from the situation as much as possible. Once the officers left, my parents sat me down and explained something that left me puzzled for years afterward. They told me that we weren't going to involve ourselves in anything concerning my grandfather or his house. Not now, not ever. If someone had broken in, it was a matter for law enforcement to handle, not us. Despite my questions at the time, they refused to elaborate further. As I grew older, I realized their reluctance likely stemmed from fear. Fear that whoever trespassed on the property might have ties to people my grandfather had once been involved with. The events of that week took another unnerving turn late one night. My parents were still awake past midnight, sitting on our small front porch making phone calls to relatives. The reception out there was better than inside the house. Meanwhile, I had gone to use the bathroom before heading off to bed. Our home had a simple layout. The bathroom sat down a hallway that led past the kitchen and living room before reaching my bedroom near the front door. After finishing up in the bathroom, I made my way back toward my room. As I approached, the hallway lights bathed everything with a dull glow, and muffled snippets of my parents' conversation drifted in through the open front door. That's when I realized something was off. My bedroom door was ajar. I slowed my steps and peered in, only to freeze as movement caught my eye. A man emerged from my room. A stranger, someone I'd never seen before in my life, stepped into the hallway just feet away from me. The sheer unreality of it all made time feel as though it had stopped. What stands out most in my memory is his eyes. Those bloodshot eyes were like nothing I'd ever seen. They weren't merely tired or irritated, they looked horrifyingly raw, as if every vein had burst into an angry red haze. His face was slick with sweat, taut with tension, and his gaze was unnervingly focused on me. Before I could scream or act, he lunged forward with shocking speed and clamped his arm around my mouth like a vice to silence me instantly. Even now, the smell stays with me, a sour cocktail of sweat mingled with chemical odors I couldn't identify. His other hand reached into his pocket and produced something small. Several pills that looked almost black, possibly dark gray. Gripped by terror but driven by pure adrenaline, I kept struggling against him as he tried forcing those pills into my mouth. Desperately twisting away from his grip, I managed to knock his hand aside. The pills tumbled to the floor and scattered. At last, I freed my mouth just enough to let out a frantic scream. The sound galvanized everything into which I stumbled backward down the hallway, screaming as panic took hold. My dad burst through the door a moment later, bypassing me completely as he charged toward the hallway where the man had been standing. Chaos quickly revealed its ugly details. Our kitchen window lay shattered, jagged pieces framing an empty void. The back door seemed battered and bruised, almost as if someone had violated its structure earlier only to carefully close it again from the inside. Without hesitation, my father dashed outside, scanning the yard and street for any sign of movement, but the mysterious intruder was already gone, as if he'd evaporated into the night. Not long after, the police arrived for the second time that day. They combed through our house, jotting down observations and piecing together fragments of what had transpired. When they questioned me about the man I had seen, I struggled to provide anything meaningful. It had all unfolded too quickly to lock visual details into memory. The most I could recall were his unsettlingly bloodshot eyes, dark clothing, and the strange handful of black pills he dropped onto our floor before disappearing. I never learned what those pills were. The aftermath of that night haunted me long afterward. Sleep became elusive. The faintest nocturnal sounds would jerk me back into waking fear. Certain moments from that evening still replay in hypervivid flashes when least expected. We never uncovered the identity of that man or why he had invaded our home, and frankly, I wasn't eager to find out. My parents must have felt similarly because they made sure we moved out not long after. That house became a memory, one buried deep. I haven't returned to that neighborhood since. At the time, I had recently graduated from community college and was juggling temporary jobs that kept my bills paid but left my ambitions feeling neglected. One of those jobs, unexpectedly, was at a funeral home. It wasn't planned. My aunt knew the owner and let me know they needed help with office work, paperwork, scheduling, and answering phones. On paper, it sounded straightforward enough, and I was more focused on securing consistent employment than pursuing dreams just then. During my interview, the owner assured me my role would be strictly administrative. No contact with embalming or body preparation, nothing physical. My workspace stretched across a snug office at the building's front where families came to make arrangements for their loved ones. It consisted mostly of clerical tasks, processing forms, preparing documents for funerals, arranging visitations on calendars, and fielding phone calls with layers of empathy for those grieving on the other end of the line. Occasionally, I'd brew coffee or walk families to viewing rooms. People often envision funeral homes as cold places steeped in mystery or dread, but for me it was surprisingly routine most of the time. Apart from the context tied to loss and mourning, it felt like any other quiet office job. The building itself was old but well kept, with floral scents mixing subtly into chemical odors of cleaning products that lingered perpetually in its air. Dim lighting softened every corner of the space, designed not for bright productivity but for solemnity befitting its primary function. Long hallways tangled everything together into intricate threads connecting storage rooms, small offices, preparation areas, and chapels. In those first few weeks, unease crept beneath the surface, an acknowledgement of what lay beyond each closed door, but soon familiarity took over. Coworkers were kind and welcoming, the owner treated us generously and respectfully. Day-to-day life settled into calm predictability unless services were scheduled. What unfolded next began roughly 4 or 5 months after I started working there. That particular afternoon was marked by a funeral for an elderly gentleman who had passed after battling a prolonged illness. His surviving family was large enough to draw significant attendance, a steady stream of visitors filling the chapel and mingling quietly throughout surrounding spaces. The ceremony stretched out over hours, flowing from late afternoon into early dusk. My duties during such events revolved around logistics rather than ceremonial aspects, primarily ensuring paperwork was ready for officiants or guests who might need administrative guidance while navigating grief's turbulence. Occasionally, smaller responsibilities like arranging chairs or checking microphones in the chapel fell to me. It started innocently like any other workday, but what transpired would leave an impression far deeper than just another name in a registry. The man whose funeral it was seemed to have been in his late 70s. I only caught a glimpse of him earlier that day during the viewing, when I passed through the chapel to deliver some documents to one of the directors. In this line of work you grow accustomed to seeing the deceased. At first it feels unsettling, but eventually, it becomes routine, just another part of the environment. By the time the service ended that evening, most of the family had already left. The staff busied themselves with cleaning and setting up for the next day as usual. Normally my shift wrapped up earlier, but that night I stayed a bit later to finalize and scan some pending paperwork. The owner had asked if I could stick around an extra hour or so to help sort out some files, and I agreed. It wasn't unusual for me to work a little longer when needed. Around 9 p.m., the building had settled into an eerie silence. Most of the staff had left, save for a couple of others working somewhere in the back. The front area where my desk was located felt especially still. I was sitting at my desk, poring over paperwork, when I discovered an issue with one of the forms, a mistake with a date that required clarification before I could file it. I decided to ask one of the directors about it, as his office was down a hallway near the rear of the building. Those hallways always felt different at night. During the day they were filled with subdued activity, muted conversations, faint phone rings, doors quietly opening and closing. But at night they shifted into something else entirely. The dim lighting and the heavy stillness gave them an almost oppressive atmosphere. Taking the paper with me, I left my office and made my way down the hallway. Several rooms lined either side, storage areas, sometimes spare spaces used by the preparation staff. About halfway down, I noticed a room with its door partially open and its lights on. That stood out. Most doors were usually closed if the rooms weren't in use. Out of habit, I glanced inside as I passed by. What I saw stopped me cold. In the center of the room sat a chair, and in that chair was a man. Or at least that's what I thought at first. But the way his body was twisted defied explanation. He wasn't sitting naturally. His posture looked impossibly contorted, as if his frame had been folded and bent in bizarre ways against the chair. His shoulders and legs were positioned unnaturally, in a way that sent an instinctive chill through me. I slowed my pace and looked again, instinctively trying to make sense of what I was seeing. That's when I got a clear view of his face, and my stomach dropped like lead. It was him. Not someone who merely resembled him. The same man whose face I had seen in the casket earlier that day. Same pallid complexion, same gray thinning hair, same unmistakable features. A wave of something indescribably foreign swept over me then, like every muscle in my body locking up all at once. My arms trembled uncontrollably, my ears filled with the rush of my own heartbeat as it thundered louder than anything else in that suffocating quiet. And then, just as instantly as I'd seen him, he was gone. The chair stood empty now, as if nothing had ever occupied it. No sound betrayed an exit. No footsteps, no movement, nothing but an abrupt absence where he'd just been. 1 second he was there, staring toward the doorway. The next second there was only silence and stillness. At that moment my body seemed to give out completely. My legs refused to move, my throat tightened as I tried to scream for help. My mouth opened and my chest strained with effort, but no sound came out, just silent panic and an overwhelming inability to act or even breathe properly. My legs felt like they might give out, and the hallway seemed to sway around me. The last thing I remembered was the ground rushing toward me as my knees buckled. The next moment I was being brought back to awareness by someone gently shaking my shoulder. When I opened my eyes, I was sprawled on the cold hallway floor. A concerned employee knelt beside me, a guy who worked in the back. He kept asking if I was okay, his face marked with genuine worry. I could barely respond as waves of disorientation hit me. My entire body felt like it had been plunged into ice water. My hands were trembling, my limbs heavy. With his help, I managed to sit up against the wall as he passed me a bottle of water. For several minutes, words escaped me. All I could mutter was that I'd felt dizzy and passed out. What I didn't tell him, what I couldn't say, was what I had seen just before losing consciousness. Even then, it defied explanation and I was too shaken to risk sounding irrational. After some time resting, he insisted that I go home for the night. Driving back was an unnerving experience. The lingering unease clawed at my mind, though I kept telling myself that it had to be nothing. Exhaustion, stress, something my mind created in a weary haze. Working late at a funeral home can take its toll, especially at night in the eerie stillness of that building. Over the next few days, I tried hard to suppress the memory. I told myself I'd been overtired, maybe even dreaming while hunched over my desk. That reasoning seemed plausible enough to silence my thoughts for a while. Soon, life returned to routine, and a week later, I found myself burning the midnight oil once again, finishing up some leftover tasks. That night started ordinarily enough. I sat in my office shuffling through documents but couldn't shake a strange sensation worming its way into my chest, a discomfort that resisted explanation. It was nothing concrete at first, just an unsettling awareness that something felt off. I instinctively glanced toward the hallway outside my office door where everything appeared just as it should be, quiet and still. Forcing myself to focus on my paperwork again, I shrugged it off. After some time, however, I needed to grab a file from the cabinet by the office door. As I walked over, my gaze flickered down the hallway almost involuntarily, and then froze on what I saw. One of the room doors stood slightly ajar, just enough for a line of light to seep through the narrow gap between the door and its frame. And then something moved in that sliver of space. It was fleeting but undeniable, part of a face, a single eye and part of a cheek, peering through the gap. The eye wasn't searching or wandering, it was fixed in one direction, looking straight at me. My entire body went rigid as icy tendrils of fear crept down my spine. Forcing myself to think rationally, I told myself it must be one of the other staff members just glancing out from inside the room. Yet something about it didn't feel right. There was something wrong with that gaze. It lacked any semblance of normal animation or humanity. Instinct took over. Without waiting to confirm what I had seen, I hastily stepped backward into my office and called out for another employee. Moments later, one of the directors hurried down the hallway toward me. In a shaky voice, I explained that I thought someone might be in the room at the end of the hall. He opened the door without hesitation and looked inside, but the room was empty. That was all it took to push me over the edge. I told him I wasn't feeling well and needed to leave early, and he agreed without question. By that point, any glimmer of rational explanation I'd clung to started slipping away. The drive home was suffocating, the weight of growing dread sitting heavily on my chest. What followed was even worse than fleeting terror. My health began to unravel without warning or reason. At first, I noticed nothing more than an overwhelming fatigue that made even basic tasks a struggle. But soon after came waves of nausea so constant that food turned into an enemy, even small bites made my stomach churn. My hair began falling out in alarming amounts when combed or washed, leaving trails of strands everywhere I went. My fingernails darkened near their edges as if bruised from within. Sometimes my tongue would inexplicably begin to bleed. Within weeks, I no longer recognized myself in the mirror, haunted shadows under my eyes, gaunt cheeks that hinted at how thin I'd become. My family's concern grew into full-fledged alarm, and though hospital visits yielded countless tests and questions from doctors about stress or lifestyle choices, they found no clear cause. As desperation grew, so did one evening the priest visited my home and spent some time speaking with me in private. He asked about my experiences at work, probing into the changes in my health that followed. After listening, he offered a prayer for me. Normally, I'm not one to dwell on or even discuss such occurrences, but I have to admit, something began to shift after that night. Over the weeks that followed, my condition gradually improved. The peculiar symptoms that had plagued me seemed to diminish bit by bit. My appetite returned, and eventually the alarming hair loss stopped completely. I never went back to that funeral home. Instead, I moved to another town to stay with my sister and soon found a new job. It's been years now, and my health has been steady and normal ever since. I often wonder whether it was all just the result of intense stress from the environment, a trick of the mind manifesting as something far more sinister. But despite my efforts to rationalize it, I'm left with no concrete answers. It remains the most bizarre and disturbing experience of my life.